The morning sun bathed the streets of Glendale in a soft, golden light. The air was crisp and fresh, carrying the faint aroma of roasted coffee beans from the small cafe on the corner of the bustling street. Michael Carter, a man in his late 30s, sat at his usual spot outside the cafe, a small table tucked neatly under the shade of a large oak tree. Beside him sat Zeus, his loyal German Shepherd guide dog, who lay calmly at his feet, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings with quiet vigilance. Michael had always cherished these peaceful mornings. Though he had lost his sight years ago, he had learned to appreciate the world through other senses: the warmth of the sun on his face, the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze, and the comforting hum of life around him. Zeus, his constant companion, was more than just a guide dog. He was a protector, a friend, and a lifeline to the world Michael could no longer see. But Zeus was not an ordinary guide dog. Before becoming Michael's partner, Zeus had served as a K-9 unit, trained to handle high-pressure situations, detect danger, and protect those in need. Though retired from his official duties, Zeus's instincts remained sharp, and his presence gave Michael a sense of security that no words could describe. As Michael sipped his coffee, he listened to the familiar sounds of the cafe. The clinking of cups, the soft chatter of customers, and the occasional laughter of passers-by created a symphony of normalcy that Michael found comforting. Zeus, ever alert, lay still but attentive, his ears twitching at every sound. To the casual observer, the pair seemed like any other man and his dog enjoying a quiet morning. But to Michael, Zeus was his anchor, his connection to a world that often felt distant and overwhelming. The tranquility of the morning was suddenly interrupted by the roar of motorcycle engines. The sound grew louder, cutting through the peaceful ambiance like a knife. Michael felt Zeus stiffen beside him, the dog's body tensing as his ears perked up. Michael reached down instinctively, his hand finding the soft fur of Zeus's neck. "What is it, boy?" he asked softly, sensing the change in his companion's demeanor. The motorcycles came to a stop near the cafe, their engines rumbling loudly before being silenced. Michael could hear the heavy footsteps of three men dismounting, their boots clinking against the pavement. The air seemed to shift, the light-hearted chatter of the cafe patrons fading into an uneasy silence. Zeus let out a low, almost imperceptible growl, a sound that Michael had come to recognize as a warning. The leader of the group, a man with a commanding presence and a loud, confident laugh, strode toward the cafe. His name was Chuck, and he exuded an air of arrogance that was impossible to ignore. Clad in a leather jacket adorned with patches, he surveyed the area with a smirk, his eyes landing on Michael and Zeus. "That's a big dog you've got there," Chuck remarked, his voice carrying a mocking tone. Michael, unable to see the man's expression, felt the tension in Zeus's body increase. He tightened his grip on the leash, his fingers brushing against the sturdy leather. "He's my guide dog," Michael replied calmly, his voice steady despite the unease creeping into his chest. "He's well-trained," Chuck chuckled, a sound that lacked genuine humor. "Well-trained, huh? Let's see about that." He took a step closer, his boots scraping against the pavement. Zeus's growl deepened, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the air. The other patrons at the cafe began to take notice, their conversations halting as they watched the scene unfold. "Easy there, big guy," Chuck said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "I'm just saying hello." But his tone was anything but friendly. He leaned forward slightly as if testing the dog's reaction. Zeus remained still, his body rigid and his eyes locked on Chuck. To anyone who knew dogs, it was clear that Zeus was issuing a silent warning: do not come any closer. Michael, though blind, could feel the tension radiating from Zeus. He reached down again, his hand finding the dog's head. "Zeus, it's okay," he murmured, though he wasn't entirely sure it was. He could sense the unease in the air, the way the cafe had grown quiet, and the way Zeus's usually calm demeanor had shifted into one of heightened alertness. Chuck, perhaps emboldened by the attention of his friends and the onlookers, decided to push further. "Is he really as smart as he looks?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He made an exaggerated gesture with his hands as if to provoke a reaction. Zeus didn't move, but his growl grew slightly louder, a sound that sent a shiver down the spines of those watching. "Hey, leave him alone," a woman's voice called out from one of the nearby tables. Her tone was firm and it carried a note of disapproval. Chuck turned his head toward her, his smirk faltering for a moment, but he quickly recovered, laughing dismissively. "Relax, lady, it's just a dog." Michael, still unaware of the full extent of what was happening, felt a surge of gratitude toward the stranger who had spoken up. "Zeus doesn't like it when people come on too strong," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Maybe you should back off." Chuck's friends chuckled nervously, sensing the growing tension. One of them muttered something under his breath, but Chuck ignored him. He took another step closer, his boots now just inches from Zeus. The German shepherd's growl turned into a sharp bark, a sound that made Chuck flinch slightly. The crowd around them gasped, and a few people began to pull out their phones, recording the interaction. All right, Chuck said, raising his hands again, but there was a glint of defiance in his eyes, a stubborn refusal to back down completely. He took a step back, his laughter echoing through the cafe. "You've got a tough dog there, buddy," he said to Michael, his tone laced with sarcasm. "Take care of him." With that, Chuck turned and walked away, his friends following close behind. The roar of their motorcycles soon filled the air again as they sped off, leaving behind a cafe full of uneasy patrons and a man who couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Michael let out a slow breath, his hand still resting on Zeus's head. "Good boy," he whispered, his voice filled with both relief and concern. Zeus, ever vigilant, remained tense, his eyes fixed on the direction Chuck had gone. Michael could feel the dog's heartbeat through the leash, a steady reminder of the bond they shared. The morning, once peaceful and serene, had been disrupted, and though the danger seemed to have passed, Michael couldn't ignore the lingering sense of unease. Zeus, with his years of training and unshakable loyalty, had sensed something Michael couldn't see, and for the first time in a long while, Michael felt a flicker of fear. As the cafe slowly returned to its usual rhythm, Michael finished his coffee in silence, his thoughts racing. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain. With Zeus by his side, he wouldn't face it alone. The morning air, once filled with the comforting hum of casual conversations and the clinking of coffee cups, had grown heavy with tension. Michael Carter sat still at his usual table, his hand resting on Zeus's head, feeling the subtle vibrations of the dog's low growl. Zeus, his loyal guide dog and former K9, was no longer the calm and composed companion he usually was. His body was tense, his ears perked, and his sharp eyes were locked on Chuck, the leather-clad biker who had decided to make them the center of his unwanted attention. Chuck, emboldened by the presence of his two friends and the growing number of onlookers, seemed determined to provoke a reaction. His smirk widened as he leaned against a nearby table, his eyes flicking between Michael and Zeus. "What's the matter, big guy?" he taunted, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of more cafe patrons. "You don't like a little fun?" Zeus's growl deepened, a low, rumbling sound that sent a clear warning to anyone who understood dogs. Michael, though blind, could feel the shift in the atmosphere. He tightened his grip on Zeus's leash, his fingers brushing against the sturdy leather as he tried to calm his companion. "Zeus, it's okay," he murmured softly, though he wasn't entirely sure it was. The tension in the air was palpable, and Michael could sense that something was about to happen. Chuck, however, was not one to back down. He straightened up and took a step closer, his boots scraping against the pavement. "Relax, man," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "It's just a dog. What's he gonna do, huh?" He glanced over his shoulder at his friends who chuckled nervously, unsure whether to encourage him or intervene. The crowd of cafe patrons had grown silent, their eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. Some whispered to each other, while others discreetly pulled out their phones to record the interaction. Michael, still unaware of the full extent of Chuck's actions, felt the unease in Zeus's body intensify. The dog's growl was now a steady rumble, his muscles coiled like a spring ready to snap. "Please," Michael said, his voice calm but firm. "Leave us alone. We're not looking for trouble." Chuck ignored him. Instead, he reached out and grabbed a nearby chair, dragging it noisily across the pavement. The sound grated against Michael's ears, but it was Zeus who reacted first. The German shepherd let out a sharp, guttural bark, his body rising slightly as he positioned himself protectively in front of Michael. The bark was loud and commanding, cutting through the air like a warning shot. Several people in the cafe flinched, and a few gasped audibly. Chuck froze for a moment, startled by the sudden outburst, but his surprise quickly turned into defiance. "Whoa, easy there, boy," he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "No need to get all worked up." His tone was dismissive, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. Zeus's bark had not been the reaction he was expecting, and it was clear that the dog was not one to be trifled with. "Hey, that's enough!" a woman's voice rang out, cutting through the tension like a knife. The voice belonged to a woman sitting at a nearby table, her face a mix of anger and concern. She stood up, her hands on her hips, and glared at Chuck. "Leave them alone! Can't you see you're upsetting the dog?" Chuck turned to face her, his smirk faltering for the first time. "Relax, lady," he said, his voice losing some of its bravado. "I'm just messing around." "Well, stop it," the woman shot back, her tone firm and unwavering. "You're not funny, and no one here is impressed." The crowd murmured in agreement, and a few people nodded their heads. The pressure of the onlookers seemed to weigh on Chuck, and he shifted uncomfortably. His friends, sensing the shift in the crowd's mood, muttered something to him, urging him to back off. But Chuck wasn't ready to let go of his pride just yet. He turned back to Michael and Zeus, his smirk returning, though it now seemed forced. "You've got a tough dog there, buddy," he said, his tone laced with sarcasm. "Better keep him on a short leash." Michael, still seated, felt a surge of frustration and unease. He couldn't see Chuck's expression, but he could hear the mockery in his voice. "Zeus is doing his job," Michael replied evenly. "Maybe you should think about doing yours and mind your own business." The crowd murmured again, this time more audibly. Chuck's smirk faltered once more, and he glanced around, realizing that the tide was turning against him. The woman who had spoken up earlier crossed her arms and stared him down, her expression daring him to continue. Chuck's friends tugged at his jacket, urging him to leave. All right, Chuck said, raising his hands in mock defeat. "I'm out of here." He took a step back, but not before shooting a final glance at Zeus. The dog's eyes were locked on him, unblinking and intense. It was a look that spoke volumes, a silent promise that any further provocation would not be tolerated. As Chuck and his friends walked away, the roar of their motorcycles soon filled the air again, fading into the distance. The cafe patrons began to relax, their conversations resuming in hushed tones. But the tension lingered, like the echo of a storm that had just passed. Michael let out a slow breath, his hand still resting on Zeus's head. "Good boy," he whispered, his voice filled with both relief and gratitude. Zeus, ever vigilant, remained tense, his eyes fixed on the direction Chuck had gone. Michael could feel the dog's heartbeat through the leash, a steady reminder of the bond they shared. The woman who had stood up for them approached their table, her expression softening as she looked at Michael. "Are you okay?" she asked gently. Michael nodded, though his brow was furrowed with worry. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "I appreciate you stepping in." The woman smiled faintly. "It's nothing. That guy was out of line." She glanced at Zeus, who was still on high alert. "Your dog is incredible. He knew exactly what was going on." Michael reached down to stroke Zeus's fur, his fingers brushing against the dog's tense muscles. "He always does," he said quietly. "He's more than just a guide dog. He's my protector." The woman nodded, her gaze lingering on Zeus for a moment before she returned to her seat. Michael sat in silence for a while, his thoughts racing. The morning, once peaceful and serene, had been disrupted, and though Chuck and his friends were gone, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Zeus, with his years of training and unshakable loyalty, seemed to sense it too. His body remained tense, his eyes scanning the surroundings as if expecting the danger to return. As the cafe slowly returned to its usual rhythm, Michael finished his coffee in silence, his hand never leaving Zeus's head. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain. With Zeus by his side, he wouldn't face it alone. The evening descended quietly over Glendale, wrapping the small town in a blanket of calm. The streets outside Michael Carter's modest apartment were mostly silent, save for the occasional hum of a passing car or the distant chatter of neighbors. Inside, Michael sat on his worn-out couch, his fingers tracing the smooth surface of a mug of tea. Zeus, his loyal German shepherd, lay at his feet, but something about the dog's posture was different tonight. Zeus wasn't relaxed, as he usually was after their evening walks. Instead, his body was tense, his ears perked, and his sharp eyes fixed on the front door. Michael could feel the unease radiating from his companion. Zeus's breathing was steady but deliberate, and every so often the dog would let out a low, rumbling growl. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to send a chill down Michael's spine. He reached down, his hand brushing against Zeus's fur. "What's wrong, boy?" he asked softly, his voice laced with concern. Zeus didn't respond with his usual wag of the tail or comforting nuzzle. Instead, he remained still, his focus unwavering. Michael leaned back, trying to shake off the tension that had settled over the room. He told himself it was nothing, just the lingering effects of the morning's confrontation at the café. Chuck and his friends had been obnoxious, sure, but they were gone now. They had ridden off on their motorcycles, leaving behind only the faint echo of their laughter. Still, Michael couldn't ignore the way Zeus had reacted to Chuck. The dog's instincts were sharp, honed from years of training as a K9, and Michael had learned to trust them implicitly. If Zeus was on edge, there was a reason. The minutes ticked by and the apartment remained quiet. Michael tried to distract himself, turning on the small radio on the kitchen counter. The soft hum of music filled the space, but it did little to ease the tension. Zeus continued to stare at the door, his growls coming more frequently now. Michael set his mug down and stood, his hand brushing against the back of the couch for support as he moved toward the door. "Zeus, what is it?" he murmured, crouching down beside the dog. He placed a hand on Zeus's neck, feeling the taut muscles beneath the fur. Zeus's growl deepened, and Michael's unease grew. Then the knock came. It was sharp and deliberate, echoing through the small apartment like a gunshot. Michael froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Zeus immediately sprang to his feet, positioning himself between Michael and the door. The dog's growl turned into a bark, loud, commanding, and filled with warning. Michael tightened his grip on Zeus's leash, his fingers trembling slightly. "Who is it?" he called out, his voice steady but edged with caution. For a moment there was silence. Then a voice answered, a voice Michael recognized instantly. "Relax, man, it's just me, Chuck." Michael's blood ran cold. He hadn't expected to hear that name again, at least not so soon. Zeus barked again, his body rigid as he stared at the door. Michael tightened his grip on the leash, his mind racing. What was Chuck doing here? How had he found Michael's apartment? And more importantly, what did he want? "What do you want?" Michael asked, his voice firm. He took a step back, pulling Zeus with him. The dog resisted slightly, his focus still locked on the door. Chuck's tone shifted, attempting to sound casual, even friendly. "Hey, I just wanted to apologize for earlier. You know, at the cafe. No hard feelings, right?" Michael didn't believe him for a second. There was something in Chuck's voice, an edge, a hint of insincerity, that set off alarm bells in Michael's mind. Zeus seemed to sense it too. The dog's growls grew louder, his body coiled like a spring ready to snap. "I don't think this is the time or place for that," Michael replied, his voice steady despite the fear creeping into his chest. "You should leave." There was a pause, and Michael could hear faint murmurs outside the door. Chuck wasn't alone. Michael's grip on Zeus's leash tightened further, his knuckles turning white. He could feel the dog's tension through the leather, a silent reminder of the danger that lurked just beyond the door. "Come on, man," Chuck said, his tone growing more insistent. "I'm just trying to make things right. Open the door. Let's talk." Michael shook his head, even though Chuck couldn't see him. "I'm not opening the door," he said firmly. "Leave now, or I'll call the police." The mention of the police seemed to give Chuck pause. Michael heard a muffled curse, followed by the sound of footsteps retreating slightly. But Zeus didn't relax. The dog remained in his defensive stance, his eyes locked on the door as if expecting Chuck to return. After a few tense moments, Michael heard the sound of footsteps fading into the distance. The apartment fell silent once more, save for the sound of Zeus's heavy breathing. Michael let out a shaky breath, his hand moving to stroke Zeus's fur. "Good boy," he whispered, his voice filled with both relief and gratitude. But the tension in the room didn't dissipate. Zeus remained on high alert, his ears twitching at every sound. Michael stood and moved to the window, pulling back the curtain slightly. He couldn't see, but he could feel the cool night air against his face. He listened carefully, straining to hear any sign of Chuck or his friends. The street outside was quiet, but Michael couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, watching, waiting. He turned back to Zeus, who had finally begun to relax, though his eyes still darted toward the door every so often. Michael crouched down beside him, running a hand through the dog's fur. "What do you think, boy?" he asked softly. "Was that the end of it?" Zeus didn't respond, of course, but his body language spoke volumes. The dog was still uneasy, his instincts telling him that the danger wasn't over. Michael sighed and sat back on the couch, his mind racing. He had dealt with difficult people before, but something about Chuck felt different. There was a malice in his voice, a sense of entitlement that made Michael's skin crawl. As the night wore on, Michael tried to push the encounter from his mind. He double-checked the locks on the door and windows, ensuring that everything was secure. Zeus followed him from room to room, his presence a comforting shadow. But even as Michael lay in bed, his hand resting on Zeus's back, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The apartment was quiet, but the silence felt heavy, oppressive. Michael's thoughts drifted back to the cafe, to the way Chuck had looked at Zeus, the way he had tried to provoke the dog. It wasn't just a random act of cruelty, it was calculated, deliberate. And now Chuck had shown up at Michael's home, uninvited and unwelcome. Michael tightened his grip on Zeus's fur, drawing comfort from the dog's steady presence. "Whatever happens," he murmured, "we'll face it together." Zeus let out a soft huff, his body finally beginning to relax. But even as Michael drifted off to sleep, his mind filled with uneasy thoughts, Zeus remained vigilant. The dog's eyes stayed fixed on the door, his ears twitching at every sound. He knew, as Michael did, that this wasn't over. The darkness outside wasn't just the absence of light, it was the presence of something far more dangerous, something that had only just begun to reveal itself. The morning light filtered through the blinds of Michael's small apartment, casting soft streaks of gold across the walls. Michael sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee. Zeus lay at his feet, his head resting on his paws, but his ears twitched at every sound from outside. The events of the previous night lingered heavily in Michael's mind. Chuck's sudden appearance at his door, the tension in Zeus's body, and the unmistakable growl that had come from deep within the dog's chest. It all felt like a warning. Something was wrong, and Michael couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. As he absent-mindedly stroked Zeus's fur, Michael's thoughts drifted back to the day he first met the dog. Zeus hadn't always been a guide dog. In fact, his journey to becoming Michael's loyal companion had been anything but ordinary. Before Zeus had entered Michael's life, he had served as a K9 unit, a highly trained working dog who had faced danger head-on in some of the most intense situations imaginable. Michael remembered the first time he heard about Zeus. It had been at a training center for guide dogs, where Michael had gone after losing his sight in a car accident. The trainers had told him about a special dog, one who had recently retired from police work and was being retrained to assist people with disabilities. "He's a bit different from the others," one of the trainers had said with a smile. "He's got a history, but he's incredibly smart and loyal. We think he'd be a perfect match for you." When Michael was introduced to Zeus, he had been struck by the dog's presence. Zeus was larger than most guide dogs, with a sleek black and tan coat and piercing amber eyes that seemed to see straight into a person's soul. There was a quiet intensity about him, a sense of purpose that set him apart from the other dogs. Michael had felt an instant connection, and it was clear that Zeus had felt it too. From that moment on, they had been inseparable. But Zeus's past as a K9 had always intrigued Michael. Over the years, he had learned bits and pieces about the dog's previous life. Zeus had been part of a specialized unit, trained to detect explosives, track suspects, and protect his handlers in dangerous situations. He had been deployed in high-stakes missions, where split-second decisions could mean the difference between life and death. Zeus had saved lives, faced threats head-on, and earned the respect of everyone who had worked with him. Michael had always admired Zeus's bravery, but he also knew that the dog's past had left its mark. There were moments when Zeus's instincts would take over, moments when the calm, steady guide dog would transform into the highly trained protector he had once been. Michael had seen it happen a few times, when a car backfired too close to them on the street, or when a stranger had grabbed Michael's arm a little too forcefully. In those moments, Zeus's K9 training would surface, and his protective instincts would kick in. Now, as Michael sat in his kitchen, he couldn't help but wonder if those instincts were returning once again. The way Zeus had reacted to Chuck at the cafe, the way he had positioned himself between Michael and the door the night before, it was as if the dog knew something Michael didn't. Zeus had always been able to sense danger, and Michael trusted him implicitly. But this time the stakes felt higher. This time the danger felt personal. Michael took a sip of his coffee, his mind racing. He thought about Chuck, the way the man had taunted Zeus, the way he had shown up at Michael's apartment uninvited. There was something about Chuck that didn't sit right with Michael. He couldn't see the man's face, but he could hear the arrogance in his voice, the thinly veiled hostility that lurked beneath his words, and Zeus had sensed it too. The dog's growls, his unwavering focus on Chuck, had been a clear indication that something was off. Michael set his coffee down and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "What do you think, boy?" he asked softly, his voice breaking the silence. Zeus lifted his head, his amber eyes meeting Michael's. There was an intelligence in those eyes, a depth of understanding that never failed to amaze Michael. Is he dangerous? Is there something I'm not seeing? Zeus didn't respond, of course, but his gaze was steady, almost reassuring. Michael reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears, feeling the tension in his own body begin to ease. You've been through so much, he murmured. You've seen things I can't even imagine, and now you're here protecting me. Michael's thoughts drifted back to the stories he had heard about Zeus's time as a K9. He remembered one in particular, a story that had stuck with him over the years. Zeus had been part of a mission to track down a dangerous fugitive who had barricaded himself in a warehouse. The situation had been tense, with the suspect armed and desperate. Zeus had been sent in to help apprehend the man, and according to the reports, he had done so with incredible precision and bravery. The suspect had been captured without anyone getting hurt, thanks to Zeus's quick thinking and training. But Michael also knew that Zeus's past hadn't been without its challenges. The life of a K9 was demanding, both physically and mentally. Zeus had faced danger on a regular basis, and while he had always risen to the occasion, the stress of the job had eventually taken its toll. When Zeus had retired, it had been clear that he needed a new purpose, a new way to channel his intelligence and energy. Becoming a guide dog had given him that purpose, and Michael had been the beneficiary of his incredible skills and loyalty. Now, though, Michael couldn't help but feel that Zeus's past was catching up with him. The dog's heightened alertness, his constant vigilance, it was as if he was slipping back into his old role as a protector. And while Michael was grateful for Zeus's instincts, he couldn't ignore the nagging worry in the back of his mind. What if Chuck was more dangerous than he seemed? What if this wasn't just a case of a bully trying to intimidate them? What if there was something bigger at play? Michael shook his head, trying to push the thoughts away. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but he also couldn't afford to ignore the signs. Zeus had always been his guide, not just in the physical sense, but in a deeper, more intuitive way. The dog had a way of sensing things that Michael couldn't, and right now, Zeus was telling him to be cautious. As the morning wore on, Michael resolved to trust Zeus's instincts. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever came their way, they would face it together. Zeus had been through the fire before, and he had come out stronger. Now it was Michael's turn to rely on that strength, to trust in the bond they had built over the years. Whatever happens, Michael said quietly, his hand resting on Zeus's head, we'll handle it, together. Zeus let out a soft huff, his tail thumping lightly against the floor. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to reassure Michael. No matter what lay ahead, he knew he wasn't alone. With Zeus by his side, he was ready to face whatever challenges came their way. The night was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The usual hum of the city outside Michael's apartment seemed muted, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Michael sat on the couch, his fingers tracing the edge of a book he had been reading earlier in the evening. Zeus lay at his feet, but unlike his usual calm demeanor, the dog was alert, his ears twitching at every faint sound. Michael could feel the tension radiating from his companion, and it was enough to set his own nerves on edge. The events of the past few days had left Michael shaken. Chuck's sudden appearance at his door, the taunts at the café, and the lingering sense of unease had all taken their toll. Zeus had been on high alert ever since, his instincts sharper than ever. Michael trusted Zeus implicitly, but the dog's heightened vigilance only confirmed what Michael already feared. The danger wasn't over. As the clock ticked past midnight, Michael began to feel the weight of exhaustion pulling at him. He leaned back on the couch, letting out a slow breath. "It's okay, boy," he murmured, reaching down to stroke Zeus's fur. "We're safe, at least for now." But even as he said the words, he wasn't sure he believed them. Suddenly, a faint noise broke the silence. It was subtle at first, a soft scraping sound like metal against wood. Michael froze, his hands stilling on Zeus's back. Zeus's ears perked up, and a low growl rumbled from his chest. The sound was deep and guttural, a warning that sent a chill down Michael's spine. "What is it?" Michael whispered, his voice barely audible. He strained to listen, his other senses heightened in the absence of sight. The scraping sound came again, louder this time, followed by the faint creak of footsteps outside the apartment. Someone was there. Zeus was on his feet in an instant, positioning himself between Michael and the door. His growl grew louder, more menacing, as he stared intently at the entrance. Michael's heart raced as he reached for his phone, his fingers fumbling slightly as he dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's calm voice came through the line. There's someone outside my apartment, Michael said quickly, his voice trembling. I think they're trying to break in. I'm blind, and I have a guide dog with me. Please send someone quickly. The operator assured him that officers were on their way, but Michael knew it would take time for them to arrive, and time was something he wasn't sure he had. The noises outside grew louder. Michael could hear muffled voices now, low and conspiratorial. He couldn't make out the words, but he recognized one of the voices immediately. Chuck. His stomach sank. Chuck wasn't just trying to intimidate him anymore. He was escalating. Zeus barked sharply, the sound echoing through the apartment. It was a warning, a clear message to whoever was outside. Stay back. But the voices didn't stop. Instead, there was a loud thud against the door, as if someone was testing its strength. Zeus barked again, his body tense and ready to spring into action. Michael's mind raced. He knew Zeus was capable of protecting him, but the thought of a confrontation terrified him. Zeus, stay, he said firmly, though his voice wavered. He reached for the leash, gripping it tightly as he tried to steady his breathing. Another thud came, harder this time, and the door rattled in its frame. Zeus let out a deep, ferocious growl, his teeth bared as he stared at the door. Michael could feel the dog's muscles coiled like a spring, ready to defend him at a moment's notice. Then, the door handle jiggled, and Michael heard the unmistakable sound of someone trying to force it open. His heart pounded in his chest as he tightened his grip on Zeus's leash. Go away, he shouted, his voice filled with a mix of fear and anger. The police are on their way! For a moment, there was silence. Then Chuck's voice came through, muffled but unmistakable. Come on, man, we're just having a little fun. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Michael's hands trembled as he held on to Zeus. Leave now, he shouted again. I'm warning you. But Chuck didn't listen. There was another loud thud, and Michael could hear the sound of wood splintering. Zeus barked furiously, his body straining against the leash. Michael knew he couldn't hold the dog back much longer. And then it happened. The door burst open, the lock giving way under the force of Chuck and his friends. Zeus didn't hesitate. With a powerful leap, he lunged toward the intruders, his bark turning into a fierce snarl. Michael could hear the chaos unfold. The sound of Zeus's growls, the startled yells of Chuck and his friends, and the scuffle of feet as they tried to back away. Get that dog off me, Chuck shouted, his voice filled with panic. Michael could hear the fear in his tone, and it gave him a small sense of satisfaction. Zeus was doing exactly what he had been trained to do, protect. The commotion didn't last long. Within moments, Michael heard the sound of footsteps retreating, followed by the slam of the apartment door as Chuck and his friends fled. Zeus stood at the door, his body still tense, his growls fading into heavy breaths. Michael reached out, his hand finding the dog's head. Good boy, he whispered, his voice shaking. Good boy. A few minutes later, the sound of sirens filled the air, and Michael felt a wave of relief wash over him. The police had arrived. He opened the door cautiously, holding onto Zeus's leash as he greeted the officers. They quickly assessed the situation, their flashlights illuminating the splintered door and the scattered footprints outside. One of the officers, a woman with a calm and reassuring voice, approached Michael. Are you okay, sir? She asked. Michael nodded, though his hands were still trembling. I'm fine, thanks to Zeus, he said, his voice filled with gratitude. They tried to break in, but he scared them off. The officer crouched down to pet Zeus, who had finally begun to relax. He's a brave dog, she said with a smile. You're lucky to have him. As the officers examined the scene, they confirmed what Michael already knew. Chuck and his friends had been trying to intimidate him. The footprints around the apartment and the damage to the door were clear evidence of their intent. But despite their efforts, they hadn't succeeded. Zeus had made sure of that. Before leaving, the officer assured Michael that they would do everything they could to track down Chuck and his accomplices. But Michael knew it wouldn't be easy. Chuck was still out there, and he wasn't the type to give up easily. As the night wore on and the apartment grew quiet once more, Michael sat on the couch with Zeus by his side. He ran a hand through the dog's fur, feeling a deep sense of gratitude and pride. You saved me, he said softly. I don't know what I'd do without you. Zeus let out a soft huff, his tail thumping lightly against the floor. Despite the danger, Michael felt a sense of comfort knowing that Zeus was always there, ready to protect him no matter what. But even as he tried to relax, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Chuck would be back, and when he came, Michael and Zeus would be ready. The morning after the attempted break-in, Michael sat at his kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. The events of the previous night replayed in his mind like a broken record. The sound of the door splintering, Chuck's voice filled with mockery and malice, and Zeus's fierce growls as he defended their home. Michael had always trusted Zeus, but last night had been a stark reminder of just how much he relied on the dog. Not just as a guide, but as a protector. But as much as Michael admired Zeus's bravery, he knew they couldn't keep living like this. The fear, the constant vigilance, the knowledge that Chuck could return at any moment. It was too much. Michael had spent the night thinking, and by the time the sun rose, he had made a decision. He wasn't going to live in fear anymore. It was time to take action. Michael reached for his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the name he was looking for, David Harper. David was a retired K-9 trainer and the man who had worked with Zeus during his years as a police dog. He was also an old friend of Michael's, someone Michael trusted deeply. If anyone could help him figure out how to handle the situation, it was David. The phone rang twice before David picked up. "Michael, it's been a while," David said, his voice warm and familiar. "How are you?" Michael hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to begin. "I've been better," he admitted. "I need your help, David. It's about Zeus." David's tone immediately shifted, becoming more serious. "What's going on? Is he okay?" "He's fine," Michael assured him. "But we've been having some issues. There's this guy, Chuck. He's been harassing us, first at the cafe, then he showed up at my apartment. Last night, he and his friends tried to break in. Zeus scared them off, but I don't think this is over. I need to make sure we're ready if they come back." There was a pause on the other end of the line before David spoke again. "I'm sorry to hear you're going through this, Michael, but you're right. Zeus is more than capable of protecting you. Why don't you bring him over to my place? We can go over some of his old training and make sure he's prepared for anything." Michael felt a wave of relief wash over him. "Thank you, David. I really appreciate it." "Of course," David said. "You're not alone in this. We'll figure it out together." Later that afternoon, Michael and Zeus arrived at David's property, a sprawling piece of land on the outskirts of town. The familiar scent of grass and the distant sound of barking dogs greeted them as they stepped out of the car. David met them at the gate, his tall frame and easy smile instantly putting Michael at ease. "It's good to see you, Michael," David said, clapping him on the shoulder. "And you too, Zeus." He crouched down to greet the dog, who wagged his tail in recognition. "Still as sharp as ever, I see." Michael smiled faintly. "He's been incredible, David. I don't know what I'd do without him." David straightened up and gestured for them to follow him. "Come on, let's get to work." They spent the next few hours going over Zeus's training. David explained that while Zeus had been retired for years, his instincts and skills were still intact. "It's like riding a bike," David said with a chuckle. "Once a K-9, always a K-9. We just need to refresh his memory." David set up a series of exercises designed to test and enhance Zeus's abilities. They started with basic commands: sit, stay, heel, and quickly moved on to more advanced tasks. Zeus responded with precision, his movements fluid and confident. Michael couldn't see the exercises, but he could hear the pride in David's voice as he described Zeus's performance. "Your boy hasn't lost a step," David said. "He's still got it." As the training progressed, David introduced scenarios that mimicked real-life threats. He had a volunteer act as an intruder, approaching Michael in an aggressive manner. Zeus immediately positioned himself between Michael and the threat, barking loudly and baring his teeth. When the volunteer backed off, Zeus relaxed but remained alert, his eyes never leaving the man. "Perfect," David said. "That's exactly what we want. Zeus knows when to escalate and when to hold back. He's protecting you without being reckless." Michael felt a surge of gratitude and pride. "Thank you, David. This means a lot." David nodded. "You're welcome. But there's one more thing we need to talk about. You. Zeus is incredible, but you need to be prepared too. If Chuck comes back, you need to know how to handle the situation." Michael listened as David walked him through a series of strategies for staying safe. He emphasized the importance of staying calm, using Zeus's cues to assess the situation, and calling for help as soon as possible. "Zeus is your first line of defense," David said, "but you're a team. You need to work together." By the time they finished, Michael felt more confident than he had in days. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he wasn't alone. With Zeus by his side and David's guidance, he felt ready to face whatever came next. The next day, Michael took another step toward reclaiming his sense of security. He went to the police station and met with the officer who had responded to the break-in. He provided a detailed account of everything that had happened, from the initial confrontation at the café to the attempted break-in. The officer listened carefully, taking notes and asking questions. "We'll increase patrols in your area," the officer assured him. "And we'll do everything we can to track down Chuck and his friends. In the meantime, make sure you stay vigilant, and if anything happens, don't hesitate to call us." Michael nodded. "Thank you. I just want to feel safe in my own home." "We'll do our best to make that happen," the officer said. Back at the apartment, Michael and Zeus settled into a new routine. They practiced the skills they had worked on with David, reinforcing Zeus's training and building their bond even further. Michael also took steps to secure the apartment, installing stronger locks and setting up a security system. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. As the days passed, Michael began to feel a sense of empowerment. He knew Chuck was still out there, and he knew the man wasn't likely to give up easily. But Michael also knew he wasn't the same person he had been a week ago. He was stronger now, more prepared, and with Zeus by his side, he felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. One evening, as Michael sat on the couch with Zeus resting at his feet, he reached down to stroke the dog's fur. "We're going to be okay," he said softly. "Whatever happens, we'll handle it, together." Zeus let out a soft huff, his tail thumping against the floor. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. No matter what the future held, Michael and Zeus were a team, and together, they were unstoppable. The night was still, the kind of quiet that felt unnatural, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Michael sat in his small apartment, the soft hum of the security system the only sound breaking the silence. Zeus lay at his feet, his body relaxed but his ears alert, twitching at every faint noise from outside. The bond between them had grown even stronger over the past few days. Michael had spent hours working with Zeus, reinforcing his training and preparing for the possibility that Chuck might return. Deep down, Michael knew it was only a matter of time. The clock ticked past midnight, and Michael felt the familiar weight of exhaustion pulling at him. He leaned back on the couch, his hand resting on Zeus's head. "We're ready, boy," he murmured softly. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Zeus let out a soft huff, his tail thumping lightly against the floor. But even as Michael tried to relax, Zeus's body tensed. His ears perked up and a low growl rumbled from his chest. Michael froze, his heart pounding. He had learned to trust Zeus's instincts, and the dog's reaction told him everything he needed to know. They weren't alone. Michael strained to listen, his other senses heightened in the absence of sight. At first, there was nothing but silence. Then faintly, he heard it, the sound of footsteps outside the apartment. They were slow and deliberate, moving closer with each passing second. Michael's grip tightened on Zeus's leash as the dog rose to his feet, his growl growing louder. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Michael's breath caught in his throat as he heard the unmistakable sound of someone trying to pick the lock. His mind raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. He reached for his phone and quickly dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice came through the line. "They're back," Michael said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "Chuck and his friends, they're trying to break into my apartment. Please send someone quickly." The operator assured him that officers were on their way, but Michael knew it would take time for them to arrive, and time was something he didn't have. The lock clicked, and the door creaked open. Michael's heart pounded as he heard Chuck's voice, low and mocking. "Told you we'd be back," he said, his tone dripping with malice. "You thought you could scare us off with your dog? Not this time." Zeus let out a fierce bark, the sound echoing through the apartment. Michael tightened his grip on the leash, his other hand reaching for the small canister of pepper spray he had started keeping by the couch. "Get out!" he shouted, his voice firm. "The police are on their way." Chuck laughed, a cold, menacing sound. "We're not afraid of the cops," he said, "and we're not afraid of your dog either." But Chuck's bravado faltered as Zeus stepped forward, his growls turning into a deep, guttural snarl. The dog's body was coiled like a spring, his sharp eyes locked on the intruders. Michael could feel the tension radiating from Zeus, and he knew the dog was ready to act. The first man stepped into the apartment, his footsteps heavy on the floor. Zeus didn't hesitate. With a powerful leap, he lunged at the intruder, his teeth sinking into the man's arm. The man let out a scream of pain, stumbling backward as Zeus held his ground. Michael could hear the commotion, the sound of the man struggling, Zeus's growls, and the panicked shouts of Chuck and his friends. "Get him off me!" the man yelled, his voice filled with fear. Chuck cursed under his breath. "Handle the dog!" he barked at one of his friends. Another man stepped forward, but Zeus was ready. He released the first intruder and turned his attention to the second, barking fiercely as he advanced. The man hesitated, clearly intimidated by the dog's size and aggression. Zeus lunged again, forcing the man to retreat. Michael stood his ground, his hand gripping the pepper spray tightly. "You need to leave," he shouted. "Now!" But Chuck wasn't ready to give up. "You think you're tough, hiding behind your dog?" he sneered. "Let's see how tough you are without him." Zeus growled louder, his body positioned protectively in front of Michael. The dog's presence was commanding, and even Chuck seemed to hesitate. But before he could make another move, the sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. "The cops!" one of Chuck's friends shouted. "We've got to go!" Chuck cursed again, but he knew they were out of time. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice filled with venom. "You'll regret this." With that, Chuck and his friends fled, their footsteps echoing down the hallway. Zeus barked after them, his body still tense, ready to give chase if necessary. Michael let out a shaky breath, his hand resting on Zeus's head. "Good boy," he whispered, his voice filled with gratitude. "You did it." Moments later, the police arrived. The officers quickly secured the area, their flashlights illuminating the damage to the door and the scattered evidence left behind by Chuck and his friends. One of the officers approached Michael, her voice calm and reassuring. "Are you okay, sir?" she asked. Michael nodded, though his hands were still trembling. "I'm fine, thanks to Zeus," he said. "He protected me." The officer crouched down to pet Zeus, who had finally begun to relax. "He's a hero," she said with a smile. "You're lucky to have him." As the officers continued their investigation, they found blood on the floor where Zeus had bitten one of the intruders, as well as fingerprints on the door. It didn't take long for them to track down Chuck and his friends, who were arrested later that night. The evidence was overwhelming, and the men were charged with attempted burglary and harassment. For the first time in days, Michael felt a sense of relief. The immediate threat was over, and Chuck was finally behind bars. But more than that, Michael felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for Zeus. The dog had been more than just a guide. He had been a protector, a guardian, and a true friend. As the night wore on and the apartment grew quiet once more, Michael sat on the couch with Zeus by his side. He ran a hand through the dog's fur, his heart swelling with pride. "You're amazing, you know that?" he said softly. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Zeus let out a soft huff, his tail wagging gently. Despite the danger they had faced, Michael knew one thing for certain. With Zeus by his side, he could face anything. The bond between them was unbreakable, forged in trust, loyalty, and love. And as Michael drifted off to sleep that night, he knew he was safe, because Zeus was watching over him, as he always had, and always would. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Michael's apartment, casting warm, golden light across the room. For the first time in what felt like weeks, the air was calm, free of tension. The faint hum of the city outside was no longer a source of anxiety, but a comforting reminder that life was moving forward. Michael sat at the kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands, and Zeus lay at his feet, his head resting on his paws. The dog's body was relaxed, his breathing steady, and for the first time in days, Michael felt like he could finally exhale. The events of the past few weeks had been harrowing, but they were over now. Chuck and his friends were in custody, facing charges for their actions, and Michael no longer had to live in fear of their return. The police had assured him that the men wouldn't be able to bother him again, and while the memory of those nights still lingered, Michael felt a profound sense of relief. He was safe. They were safe. Michael reached down and ran his hand through Zeus's fur, feeling the warmth and strength of the dog beneath his fingers. "We did it, boy," he said softly. Zeus's ears perked up at the sound of Michael's voice, and his tail thumped gently against the floor. "You kept me safe. I don't know how I'll ever thank you." Zeus let out a soft huff, as if to say that no thanks were necessary. For him, protecting Michael wasn't a duty. It was instinct, a natural extension of the bond they shared. Michael smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. He had always known that Zeus was special, but the events of the past few weeks had shown him just how extraordinary the dog truly was. As the days passed, Michael and Zeus began to settle back into their routine. The tension that had hung over their lives like a dark cloud slowly began to lift, replaced by a sense of normalcy that Michael hadn't realized how much he missed. They returned to their morning walks, their trips to the café, and their quiet evenings at home. But while their routine was the same, something had changed, something deeper, more profound. Michael found himself reflecting often on the bond he shared with Zeus. When he had first met the dog, he had thought of him as a guide, a companion to help him navigate the world after losing his sight. But now, he understood that their relationship was so much more than that. Zeus wasn't just a guide. He was a protector, a partner, and above all, a friend. The trust between them was unshakable, forged not just through training but through the trials they had faced together. One afternoon as they walked through the park, Michael found himself smiling at the sound of children laughing and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Zeus walked beside him, his pace steady and confident, his leash loose in Michael's hand. The sun was warm on Michael's face, and for the first time in weeks, he felt truly at peace. They stopped at a bench near the edge of the park, where Michael sat down to rest. Zeus settled at his feet, his head resting on Michael's knee. Michael reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears, his fingers moving gently through the soft fur. "You know," he said, his voice thoughtful, "I used to think I was the one taking care of you. But now I realize it's the other way around. You've been taking care of me all along." Zeus let out a soft, contented sigh, his tail wagging lazily against the ground. Michael chuckled, the sound light and free. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he continued. "You're more than just my guide, Zeus. You're my family." The words hung in the air, and Michael felt a lump rise in his throat. He had always been a private person, someone who preferred solitude to crowds, but Zeus had changed that. The dog had brought light into his life, a sense of connection and purpose that he hadn't realized he was missing. And now, after everything they had been through, that bond felt unbreakable. As the weeks turned into months, the memory of Chuck and his threats began to fade. Michael no longer flinched at the sound of footsteps outside his door or tensed at the creak of the floorboards at night. The security system he had installed gave him peace of mind, but more than that, it was Zeus's presence that made him feel safe. The dog's quiet strength, his unwavering loyalty, was a constant source of comfort. One morning, as they walked through the neighborhood, Michael heard a familiar voice call out to him. "Michael! Zeus!" It was Sarah, the woman from the café who had stood up for them during Chuck's first confrontation. She jogged over to them, her voice warm and cheerful. "It's so good to see you both," she said. "How have you been?" Michael smiled. "We're doing well, thanks. Things have finally settled down." Sarah crouched down to pet Zeus, who wagged his tail in greeting. "I'm so glad to hear that," she said. "You've got a real hero here, you know." Michael nodded, his smile widening. "I know. He saved me in more ways than one." They chatted for a while longer before parting ways, and as Michael and Zeus continued their walk, Michael felt a renewed sense of gratitude. The world could be a dark and dangerous place, but it was also filled with kindness, with people like Sarah who were willing to stand up for what was right. And with Zeus by his side, Michael knew he could face whatever challenges came his way. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned shades of pink and orange, Michael and Zeus sat on the balcony of their apartment. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint scent of flowers from the park below. Michael leaned back in his chair, his hand resting on Zeus's head. "You know," he said, his voice soft, "I used to think losing my sight was the worst thing that could have happened to me. But then I met you, and you showed me that life doesn't have to stop just because things get hard. You've given me so much, Zeus, more than I could ever put into words." Zeus let out a soft huff, his tail wagging gently. Michael smiled, his heart full. The danger, the fear, the uncertainty, they were all behind them now. What lay ahead was a future filled with hope, with the quiet joy of knowing that he wasn't alone. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, Michael reached down and scratched behind Zeus's ears. "Come on, boy," he said. "Let's go for one last walk before bed." Zeus rose to his feet, his tail wagging eagerly. Together they stepped out into the night, the world around them bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. The air was cool, the city alive with the sounds of life, and Michael felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in a long time. As they walked side by side, Michael knew that the bond he shared with Zeus was unbreakable. They had faced danger together, overcome fear together, and now they would move forward together. Whatever the future held, one thing was certain: Michael and Zeus were a team, and nothing could ever change that.